Hi friends, Ray Lutz with Citizens Oversight. Today is one of a number of videos we're going to be making about how we can provide better oversight to our elections in this upcoming 2016 November election process. Today the video is about the Snapshot Protocol and about the audit process. Audits are extremely important for us to keep track of whether or not our elections were run correctly. Unfortunately, the audits are not being done very well, and a lot of that is our own fault by not providing enough oversight and demanding that they are done correctly. And so this is what we want to do in this upcoming election by establishing a set of teams in at least the top 24 counties in California, which amounts to about 92% of the votes. The top 12 accounts for 75% of the votes. The top 3 counties, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Orange County, account for half of the votes in the state. So at least in those, especially those top 3, we need to do a very good job. But if we can do the top 24, then we're hitting 92% of the votes, and that's a pretty darn good coverage. So this picture here is what we're going to speak to today. And if you see this top block here, this represents, the yellow part here represents a square. If you can maybe see the little tiny squares in there, which is a 40 by 40 grid, and if you multiply that together you get 1,600. In San Diego County there are 1,522 precincts, and so they're going to be choosing 1% of those. It turns out that's rounded up to 16, and you can see this year the little blue dots in there are the precincts which they decided, that they chose randomly to be those precincts that are going to be counted. And so this top block here, there's a number of different classes of ballots that you see behind here. So what they've done is, historically, they're doing 1% of the polls ballots, which is the yellow, and those are the ballots that were cast in person at the polling place. And then the next layer behind that are the early arriving vote by mail ballots that came in that night and are probably totaled up. And the first thing you see when the results are provided on the news at 8 p.m., those are those early arriving vote by mail ballots. And the next layer back from that are the late arriving or late process. They're not late, but they're just the later arriving ones. And then the final block back there that you see is the provisional ballots. Now in San Diego and most other counties, they've been excluding these last 2 layers. And even though they're choosing precincts here 1% and getting these top 2 layers, and if you walk in you see people dutifully looking at all of the ballots and by hand and tallying them up, taking a real long time doing it. And partly that's a cover story, and it turns out mostly a sham unless we can get them to do everything right. And I'll explain that a bit more later, but they're only doing these top 2. The lawsuit, which we're just gotten the ruling from the judge on, he has supported our case that they're required to do all of the layers, not just the top 2 layers. In San Diego, these bottom 2 layers counts for about 285,000 ballots, or about 37% of the election. It's quite a large number. So what happens here then is they bring these ballots in, they go through a scanning process, an automatic scanner of some kind. In San Diego they use a whole fleet of little precinct scanners that they pulled in from the precincts to do their scanning. And other places they might use a big high-speed scanner, and that's all fine. And then here you get the computer data file, which is the complete count of all of these layers, all of the layers, and all of the ballots are on that file. Now at the end of election night, they do produce normally a set of unofficial results. And what we want to get is is what we're calling the snapshot file. And we call this a snapshot protocol because the important part here is that this snapshot file is then transferred to an outside party, which will be our volunteers, and the Citizens Oversight has created a database of results in terms of collecting these snapshot files at the right time, because the snapshot file needs to be collected before they choose which precincts they're going to be tallying up by hand. This is very important. It's very important that not only are the precincts chosen randomly using some sort of random process so that it's completely unpredictable which ones they will choose, but also it needs to be a surprise to whoever's doing it. It needs to be done after they've transferred the file to us. That's because we need to have these ballots here. This represents all of the physical ballots. Each one of those little squares in there is one precinct. And that amounts to somewhere between usually less than 400 ballots. Sometimes they're as small as 50 or 100 ballots. All of these precincts here, and one more thing I want to say is the word precinct means consolidated precincts. They're not actually all individual precincts, although most of them are. So anyway, we have these, we're going to say precincts for our purposes here today. So these precincts here are all scanned and put onto this, but they may not have done all of the layers yet. But let's just not worry about that right now. This is one of the issues that we have. Let's say, for example, that they were able to do the entire election. They put it onto the disk, they give us the snapshot file, and we take it off site and make sure that it's fixed. Then they choose the random selection and then do the manual tally process. Then they do a comparison between the results of the manual tally and whatever the computer file said. So here's the thing. If you were someone who wanted to rig the election, how would you do it? Most important vulnerability that these systems have is the ability to go into this computer file right here and change maybe 1,000 different precincts by changing 10 or 20 votes toward one candidate and away from another. Not a very large number in any one precinct, so it's not really noticeable. But when you take 1,000 of these, which is about 2/3 of the number here, and you alter them, then you're talking about 10 or 20,000 votes changed from one candidate to the other, or one side of a proposition to another. Anyway, whatever the ballot option is. And so then that can flip the election. Now, if you're somebody who wants to hack the election, first of all, your candidate, let's say your candidate, just to make it easy, is running, you're expecting them to lose, or you're noticing that they're losing, and what you do is you modify a lot of those precincts to move it up. You're not going to want to just move it up by a percentage point. You're going to have to go at least 2 or 3 because you want it to be a landslide victory so that no one is going to question the result. So if it's within 1%, it goes through an automatic retallying process, so you definitely don't want to get involved in that. So you're going to have to move it by 10 or 20,000 votes if it's a statewide election in one county, like San Diego. So what we have to do is, to make sure the audit is clean, we have to first, step number 1 is secure these ballots when they go through the process to make sure they're not being altered. We're also going to want to do other things that come outside of this snapshot protocol audit process, which amounts to making sure that they're not modifying the ballots on the way in. And this is especially important for these vote by mail ballots, which are arriving sometimes a month ahead of time. And historically, volunteers have not been in the elections office a month ahead of time to watch what goes on. And this has been a big mistake because, at least in San Diego, we notice there's a lot of whiteouts and extra marking added by teams of people that have no oversight whatsoever to these early arriving vote-by-mail ballots because they have so much time to manipulate them. So we secure the ballots, step 1. Step 2, we get the snapshot file. Step 3, they're going to be doing the selection and the manual tally process for those few precincts that you see in there. And then when they compare them, then we're going to be able to check with our exported file here and make sure that they haven't been altered. So what would happen if someone did alter the election? Well, there's a chance that one of these little blue spots here might hit one of the ones that they are modifying. In fact, if they hit 2/3 of them, there's a pretty good chance that they would be, one of them would be hit in this selection, at least a few of them. And in that case, what we would notice that they would not match exactly, and then we would want to say, oh, well, we need to actually look into this further if we actually detect that. What they've been doing, though, this is a really big problem, is they do find an inconsistency here. And then in those samples that you see, the blue ones, and they run them back through the scanners, change this result, and then say everything is fine. Well, that's like, let's say an analogy is a production line of TVs, let's say, and you got 1,500 TVs, and you decided to sample 16 TVs to see if your production line is running pretty good. And you notice that there's a few TVs that are broken, they don't work. You fix them, okay, and then they're working now. And now you put them back on the line. Well, fortunately, that's what they're doing. They're just fixing a few precincts and then deeming the whole thing as okay, when in fact, what that actually meant is that the entire production line is suspect. If you had a few failures in even your 1% check, then according to sampling inspection techniques, then you would go up to a larger sample to see what's going on. Instead, what they're doing is they're just saying, okay, everything is fine, because now we've rescanned those and now they match. All that has done really is just prove that there's really a big problem. And that's what's been going on in San Diego for a while. The other problem is not getting all of the layers here. And these top 2 layers, if it's a larger district, then they can get these done in time because the first layer is all scanned by election night. The second layer is scanned before election night. So those are all done. The late arriving vote by mails and the provisionals are not done yet. And so what would be a bad technique would be to just count those later for the same precincts. Why is that bad? It's because then they know what the precincts are and they would just avoid those if they want to fix those layers and, fraudulently change those layers. You just don't choose those very few blue spots and you can change it quite a bit in those other layers there. Some of the districts, an example is Fresno, Imperial, there's a few other districts which are choosing their 1% in advance of the election. This is the most ridiculous thing that you could possibly do because it turns the whole manual tally process into a complete sham. They may be randomly chosen, but if you know which one they are and you want to hack it, you just miss those very few dots there, and then they go through the process of doing the manual tally. But if you're a hacker, you already know what they are. They're already on even on their website, not even a secret. And if you were an insider, you would definitely know. So our job then is to be very, very carefully watch this audit process, understand it, make sure that they're securing the ballots before they do the 1% selection, that we get a data file out of them, and we watch this and see what happens when they compare to see if they're just running it back through. And if they are, if we detect a problem, see, they're not going to ever find anything. A lot of these counties are going, okay, there's no variations whatsoever, no variances. Yeah, well, you're not going to find anything if everybody knows what the selection is. It's like somebody, the IRS, saying we're going to audit you, but we're going to, first of all, we're not going to cover many of your transactions. Those are just going to be out. We're going to tell you which ones those are in advance, and we're going to tell you which ones we're going to check in advance. Well, if they're going to tell you which ones they are, then you may as well not even do an audit, because the people who are being audited are going to make sure that those very few blue dots there are perfect. And this is what happened with Michael Vu, the San Diego Registrar of Voters in Cuyahoga County. They were actually chose the blue dots based on the ones that would match. And in the 2004 election, they were convicted of fraudulent electioneering here. So now, what's going to happen? We're going to need to have teams set up in the various counties throughout the state that understand this audit process, that can help us get the snapshot file, because it's been sort of difficult to get this out of the registrar at a specific time. We believe that we have a right to it, though, because we have a right to observe the election. We have a methodology here of observing the election, their processing, and it just amounts to getting one file at a very specific time. This file has to be broken down by precinct and by voting, which layers it is. We want to have it all broken down so we know exactly, so that we can compare when they pull these precincts out. We have to have whatever they're counting here, we have to have that in our data file in advance. And if they're going to do it in stages, then we might have to have several data files that represent these stages. And each time we get a data file, then they choose randomly from it, and then they do the counting, not just use the same blue dots. So snapshot is the key thing, is getting the snapshot data file, because then they can't undo things. Why is this important? Let me just cover this again. If they chose the precincts in advance, then they know which ones they are, they just avoid them, and they do this sham checking here to the ones that they know are going to match. So that is a complete sham, and we've got to get rid of this choosing the precincts in advance. But let's say they don't choose the precincts in advance, and they're choosing it after the election, but we didn't get the data file. All they have to do then is they choose the precincts, but before they produce this report to compare with, the hacker just goes in, fixes back up all these blue dots, any ones that they changed before, they unchange them so that now they're going to match. So now their data file is correct, and then they put out a report here that's going to match, and we'll never know. The only way we can catch it is if we get a snapshot file and we get it in advance of them choosing the random selection, and that random selection has to be done after the election. Okay, so that'll be it for this video. We're going to cover more about what to do very, very specifically in your teams in subsequent videos. Bye now. Ray Lutz, Citizens Oversight. Come to our website. Make sure you fill out the sign-up form so we know who you are and we can get you set up with your teams.